Cool.
All right, so we are on and recording. Welcome to Virtual Executive Directors Q&A sesh. Tonight, we're going to be talking about boundaries for nonprofit leaders. I am Becky Caldwell, and I'm the founder of Virtual Executive Director. I am a real-life executive director of the Virginia Highlands Festival in Abingdon, Virginia. And I founded this group, Virtual Executive Director, because I needed some help. And I think a lot of my fellow leaders needed some help too. And so it's a place where we can all come together and help solve each other's problems. And one of the problems that comes up very frequently for us, like way more than, and you'd think the number one problem would be like fundraising or marketing or audience building. Nope, it's boundaries because we work in nonprofit. And so what that means is sometimes people feel like they can do things like call us any time of the day when they have a question, or expect a reply to a text message or an email while we're on vacation, or gosh, there were just so many. I won't dive into like all the boundary issues. When I asked this question in an executive directors group, it was just like exploded. The feed just exploded with like things that people are dealing with. And so I have with me my very own boundary setting expert, Jen Moff. Jen is a certified relationship coach, right? And she is a, I took a course with her over last fall and into the winter that I'm not even lying when I say it changed my life. It my stress level has gone way down. My boundaries are firm. My ability to communicate effectively has gone up, and I am just so grateful to her for having that course at all, and then also for making time tonight to be here and share her expertise with all of us, because I know that this is something that we all are dealing with, and it's hard. Jen, it's hard.
It is hard, Becky. It's so hard.
It's so hard. So I'm going to mute myself right now because Jen has a sort of like masterclass style presentation to do for us. And then I will unmute, and Steve and whoever else might pop on here can ask questions. And then we'll be done, in and out by 9 o'clock Eastern. How awesome is that? All right, Jen, take it away.
Thank you so much, Becky. Tonight's masterclass, so to speak, is about an hour long, and we have a lot of material to cover, so I want to just dive right in. By the end of the next hour, you'll have a deeper understanding of how not to let other people walk all over you, so you can continue to make a difference in the work that you're passionate about and enjoy your personal life without feelings of guilt, obligation, or trepidation, okay? Plus, you're going to walk away with some really simple tools to help you stand up for yourself. Sound good? Okay. Whether it happens in the office or in your personal life, I know that there may be people that we cross paths with who might make us nervous, take advantage of our niceness and commitment, or even guilt us into doing things that we don't really like doing or don't have time to do. You know what I'm talking about. You know. But in case you're still like, what does that mean? Here's some examples. It could be picking up somebody else's slack that had to leave early. It could be having to run an extra errand because something didn't line up timeline-wise. Answering emails way past your bedtime, or thinking you don't have a choice when it comes to your personal time. Sound familiar? It is no fun to be a doormat. I think we can all agree on that truth, and have people walk all over you just feels like shit. And I've been where you may be right now. I have. And I've learned the importance of standing up for myself. There was a time in my life that I had basically lost my voice. And it resulted in me accepting really disrespectful relationships from employers and in my personal life, because how we do one relationship is how we do them all. It could also have resulted in me taking what I like to call soul-sucking jobs. And finally, basically living my life so as not to disappoint people or out of fear of rejection, okay? The woman you see before you now has learned how to use her voice with respect for her rights. End of story. And I've ended abusive relationships. I've left jobs and companies that have embodied disrespectful expectations. And as Becky so graciously said, you know, I'm a life coach and an energy healer, and I specialize in using mindfulness to help assist others with stress reduction, improving their relationships, cultivating killer communication skills, and living authentically. I also do have a BFA in communications, and I'm a certified relationship specialist by the American Psychotherapy Association of America. Tonight, we're going to cover three main things. First main thing is why we struggle with standing up for ourselves. So you got to know why we do it, because otherwise, without awareness, we're just going to keep trying to put a Band-Aid on something that just randomly rips our skin off, and we don't understand how to prevent our skin from getting ripped off. That doesn't help. Number two, we're going to talk about what we usually do in these uncomfortable situations and what to do instead. And then finally, we're going to talk about how to have some difficult conversations with more confidence, compassion, and ease. So I don't want us to get too far ahead of ourselves. Let's backtrack a little bit and start with the first thing. Why do we struggle? Now I'm going to flip over to the screen share so we can do that. Okay. Let me get all the way up to the top. And here we go. Can everybody see that? Okay. Perfect. Right on. I'm just arranging my tiny windows for Zoom over there. All right. So first question we've got to ask and answer is, why do we struggle? Well, unconscious patterns are running our lives, essentially. Well, what are unconscious patterns? What are they? A simple definition is they are a pattern that is a habit that is repeated until it develops a neural pathway in the brain. So here is a lovely, I didn't make this myself, I can't take credit here. However, this is a great image of what the inside of the brain looks like. The red areas are essentially what's called a synapse. This is where two dendrites, the long part with the bulb at the end, one is connected to the other. You want to think of this kind of like a key going into a lock, and a connection is formed. You know, when you go to Home Depot, you get a new key made for your house, and the first time you put it into the lock, it's a little bit tight or just feels kind of funny. It has a tough time getting in there, but the more you use it, the easier it is to use. Same principle here with the synapses in your brain. When one thing happens, it fires that connection, that key going into the lock. Initially, there's not that strength, that support there, but over time of repeated patterns of having those synapses firing again and again and the key going into the lock again and again, it makes it easier and easier for the brain to feel certain emotions or run on autopilot, so to speak. Why do unconscious patterns develop? Well, they are ways that we learn to feel safe and loved in the world. Let me explain. How they form is basically widely believed that they're developed in childhood, specifically during the first 5 years of life, and even up to year 8, there can be significant moments of learning and things that would cause the patterns to be cultivated and developed. And they're developed specifically from reacting to fears, whether they are a real fear or something that's just perceived, both of which are valid and real to the person because it's subjective. Now, the next question we want to ask is, well, where are those things learned? Here's a common adage that I learned when I was young: sugar and spice and everything nice, that's what good little girls are made of. Another variation of that is basically, good girls are nice, boys don't cry. It's these things that are taught to us about what is acceptable. And then the dreaded T word, too. Not too as in also, but too as in too much, too loud, too sensitive, too something. Or on the extreme flip side, it's the feelings of not being enough of something. And who tells us these things? It's typically 4 big areas: our family of origin, society in general, and that, you know, is essentially the culture of where we originate. Eastern cultures versus Western cultures have very different concepts of what is right, what the media tells us, and even within the church and religious organizations that can be found as well. These teachings become our truth. And our truth is what we believe about ourselves. It's our story. And our story is like an audio track that we may listen to when we go to sleep. So, you know, say you go and buy Tony Robbins' The Power Within on CD and you plug it in, and, you know, this is clearly back in the 90s before it was able to be downloaded. And you plug it in on a Discman and you plug in your headphones and you're like, okay. And you're sleeping and it's going into your subconscious mind. It's the same thing. We're not conscious of listening to it because we're asleep, but it's there playing in the background. That's the same way our story works. Unfortunately, the story that we have developed during years 1 through 5 stays with us as our body gains in years and gets older. The inner person that we are, our inner child, not just this physical body that is now 35 years old, but this gentle person that's inside of me, my inner child, is embodying a couple of things. One, it represents our childlike capacity for innocence, for wonder, joy, awe, sensitivity, and playfulness. And that's all positive. On the other side, it also holds our accumulated hurts, our traumas, our fears, our angers, our slights, all of those things. According to psychologytoday.com, true adulthood hinges on knowing, accepting, and taking responsibility for loving and parenting one's own inner child. That is the truth about what emotional and psychological maturity actually is and stems from. The other reason we struggle is because of the woundings that our inner child has. To become adults, we've been taught that our inner child must be stifled, quarantined, or even killed. Essentially, there's this period of young years where it's like, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? I want to be a fireman. Well, what do you want to be when you get older, Susie? I want to walk on the moon. And that's all good and well and fine until some arbitrary number comes along when it's, you have to start thinking about real life and you've got to be realistic and start thinking about your future. Stop playing games. You have to have something valuable. And so there's this idea that we've disconnected from our true desires and things that matter to us. How do we know that we're doing things based on all of this wounding? Well, there are 6 ways our wounding manifests. Number 1, it's what's called in psychology the false self. And this is basically the mask that we put on to be okay in the world and help us avoid pain. And unfortunately, it is the thing that gives birth to the next 5 ways that inner wounding shows up. So number 2, we have low self-esteem. These can be when we feel feelings of shame. And remember, shame is not feeling like we did something bad, but that we are bad. Feeling guilty about a decision that we made, a choice, who we are. And essentially, it comes back to 3 core beliefs that we have about ourselves. I'm not worthy, I'm not enough, I'm not lovable. Those are the things that we've been taught when things have been taught to us by those 4 key areas that we mentioned earlier. Now, number 3, it manifests in anxiety over or fear of abandonment, rejection, the unknown, and both failure or success. Now you may start to notice, okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits in together about the boundaries, because there's definitely times that I do things because I'm afraid of failing at something, or I'm afraid of getting rejected and passed over for a promotion because I don't want to screw something up. So this is why we have to know the boundary basement before we can start climbing the stairs to get to that first floor, okay? Next, number 4. We have trust issues. That's another way it shows up. And trust issues can be a couple of things. Unable to identify and trust safe people. So you don't even know what constitutes as somebody that is safe in your work environment or in your personal environment. So you end up in abusive relationships, and you can have an abusive boss. Yes, you can. And then finally, we aren't trusting ourselves. And we know that we're not trusting ourselves when we second guess a decision. We feel the need to ask others and get everybody else's feedback and opinions before we do something, or we start overthinking whatever choice that we've made. Number 5, it manifests in what I call reality distortions. Another term for this are cognitive distortions. So some examples here are projecting. So whatever you're feeling and thinking, you assume the other person or group of people is thinking and feeling. Minimizing is when we would downplay what we're going through. Or on the opposite side of things, we exaggerate. We puff up and make a big deal about something. Idealizing. We can idealize ourselves and put ourselves up on this pedestal of perfectionism, or we do that with another party and hold ourselves to this unrealistic idea of what we are capable of or should, quote unquote, be doing. Catastrophizing is when, say I lost this pen, and I basically think that the world is going to end because of it. The big worst case scenario with a very small, insignificant, so to speak, catalyst. And then finally, denial is another big one. When we brush off what we're going through or what we've experienced or feeling because of those same things from before. Fear of or anxiety around all of the ideas of success or rejection, failure, or abandonment. And last but certainly not least, it manifests with difficulty in empathizing or bonding. So we can feel very disconnected from others. We might be able to give and be very helpful with other people, but struggle with receiving help. And just chronically feel, I see a hand raised over there. And also chronic depression. So now that we've talked about those 6 ways it manifests, I want to tell you something. I'm going to let you in on a secret. It's the simple truth that causes you to feel taken advantage of, resentful, guilty, burned out, like a doormat because you haven't stood up for yourself, whether it's at work, in a business you own, on the side from doing this work, or even in your personal life with your loved ones. The secret truth is you've abandoned yourself. That's a tough one. You may even be slightly aware of this if you already have the notion that you are a bit of a people pleaser or a perfectionist or are even slightly codependent in your tendencies. Now, we've talked about the first main thing today. I want to transition now and talk about some of the current issues you as nonprofit leaders have, and what you're usually doing, as well as what to do instead. So here are 6 boundary themes that nonprofit leaders struggle to implement for themselves. Okay? First, we have relationships, or relational. Now, here's a couple of examples of this theme showing up. We allow people to speak to us in ways that are hurtful. We use work projects to avoid our personal relationships. Another hand raised. We have a fear of delegating responsibilities because of trust or control issues. We also blur the lines between business relationships and personal relationships. Number 2, finances, or financial stuff. Here we may be using personal money to pay for things for your staff, for your volunteers. And you don't reimburse yourself. And even here, you might not even be instituting well-deserved raises, whether it's for you or for your employees. Because money, because you're a nonprofit, is the argument you make. Number 3, your personal time. This is a biggie. How many of you answer your emails, texts, or phone calls on your personal time? Because that's a big one. How many of you feel that you are expected to be available 24/7? And here's a few more. You feel guilty for maybe not wanting to spend your personal time in meetings or appointments or at events that you've been invited to, for work events outside of your regular hours. So there's resentment. And then you feel guilty when you do take time off because there are other people working. Number 4, a segue from personal time is your vacation. Not just after you get off work at the end of the night, not just a regular day off, but specific vacation. Okay? Here, you're guilty of maybe checking your email, your work email, because it's hard to let go. Or you find somebody still knows that they can get in touch with you, and so you're doing work stuff on vacation time. But the problem here becomes you're not fully present because you're physically on vacation, but you're not in the office and doing some of that, so you're not giving your best to work. And then you're on vacation with people that you care about and want to be on vacation with, but your head's not there because you're over there. So neither one of you is getting you at your best. Number 5, your health and wellness. You don't take time off to care for yourself because there's this notion that's been taught by society that hard work, long hours, etc., is what is the right thing to do. Maybe you don't take your lunch break, or if you do take it, it's while you're doing something else, or you don't use it for your lunch, you use it for a meeting. You're not moving your body regularly because you're seated at a desk in a cubicle environment, and you're again thinking, I've got to get this stuff done, I've got deadlines, I've got to do this, and it's just this never-ending cycle. And you stay seated, you don't get any fresh air, you don't even take a short break. And then finally in this section, you let your vacation time expire in the name of really caring about the job. And then number 6, finally, social media. This is kind of a different one. On one hand, sometimes you can dive in and use it as a distraction from your work. And then other times, it's related to the work itself, and you found yourself feeling the pressure to market and use these free resources. So you spread yourself super thin all over as many different platforms as possible. And you're going wide instead of going deep, and you're yielding very little results. So now that we've talked about what specific issues nonprofit leaders struggle with, let's talk a little bit about what usually happens in those situations. So what typically happens? What do you usually do? Well, our story informs what we usually do, how we behave. We react. Reactivity is tied to our emotions, and it comes from a place of defending oneself. Remember that false self that we talked about before? This is the mask that we put on that protects us from pain. That's where defensiveness comes from. It's keeping, if the false self is a mask, just like a suit of armor, we put it on to protect ourselves so we don't get hurt. It's the same thing. So we have ways that we deflect with a shield and with a sword, or, a slingshot even. I don't know. I'm thinking of really medieval devices to use in war. But the essence is the same. We react to perceived fear, and we defend ourselves at all costs because our safety and well-being in our subconscious is at stake. So that being said, reactivity, is important to know, is a habit. It's just a habit that's driven by beliefs of the subconscious mind. That's it. Reacting is what I like to call unconscious, is part of what I like to call unconscious communication. And these are essentially unintentional ways that we communicate either verbally or non-verbally with each other. So whether you are the one reacting or the other person or people or group is the where the reactivity lies, any bit of reactivity is going to lead to frustration in any kind of conversation, communication, conflict. So now that we know what usually happens, and we could get into specifics. For example, your feelings get hurt, you feel slighted, you feel disrespected, you might snap at somebody, you might puff up and start yelling, or you might shrink down and say, I'm sorry, and feel resentful later. All of those things are normal, okay? And again, just habits. So here's what we do instead, so we can move through this situation or situations rather than getting stymied at them. So instead of reacting, we want to respond. I got one slide ahead, but not bad. So how do we do that? We do that with what I like to call the airplane metaphor. And now here we are at the airplane picture. So this is inside the cockpit, and you can see a little arrow there pointing to all the dials and switches and the lights there for the pilot and co-pilot to be able to monitor. And it's a beautiful, calm night. Nothing's going on. So we're going to zoom in on the switch that is really important. There's the autopilot, either switch to engage or disengage. So when it's a nice calm flight, planes these days run on autopilot. The pilots are there to monitor things, make sure everything's going smoothly, use certain things in specific situations. But in general, it's not like they need to be sitting there at the helm and steering and pull like constantly. That's manual. We have the technology where that's not necessary except in extenuating circumstances. So imagine there's a really bad storm that's come in and turbulence is extremely bad. They may switch from autopilot to manual control so that they can better navigate the situation. It's the same kind of thing with any conflicts or communication issues that we have in volunteer environments or board situations, or with essentially a startup nonprofit. We have to be able to discern whether or not we can just kind of run on autopilot, or we need to disengage and go into manual mode. So here's 5 steps for you to switch to manual controls, because this is the sweet spot that's going to help you go into that moving through space rather than the stalemate space. So step number 1, you want to use mindfulness. Reasons for this are, with regular practice, mindfulness has the ability to calm and relax the mind, and because there is a mind-body connection, we'll feel that calmness running through our entire physical self. Mindfulness also allows us to observe what we're feeling without judgment. So it alleviates the feelings of guilt, resentfulness, or shame that are key components to all of that reactivity in the inner childhood wounding. And then finally, mindfulness creates a space for choice. And that's how we move from reacting to responding. We have to make a choice of doing something differently rather than just running on that autopilot. Number 2, we want to take everyone's well-being into consideration. So this is basically another way of saying use your empathy. Use empathy, not just cognitive empathy, but emotional empathy here. So imagine that Becky and I are on a project for her work, and at the Arts Festival, I'm a volunteer, and I feel like she snapped at me. What this would mean for me when I'm going to speak to her about it would be, let me put myself in Becky's shoes. What is going on with Becky? What must her pressures be like? What must her day look like right now? What could be going on in her personal life? All of these things, really getting imaginative and exploring what's possible, helps us to empathize with them and be able to take everybody's well-being into consideration, because we are all connected on an energetic level. So knowing how this other person's story is playing out helps inform how we respond. Number 3, you want to think about your big picture desires. Well, what if you don't know your big picture desires? Then that's something you also need to explore. Now, when I say think about big picture desires, it's really as simple as that. If you want this particular relationship, say I'm a volunteer again with Becky, and I care deeply about the relationship because the festival is something that I've grown up with and I want to be a part of it and have it be a part of my legacy, I'm not going to let her and my conflict in one single situation ruin what my big desire is for myself and the organization. So another way of putting that is one of the, I believe, Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People begin with the end in mind. It's another way to think of that. Number 4, you want to stay aligned with your values. And if you can't list off your values right now, that's also something that has to be done and identified. If you don't know what your values are, if you don't know what you stand for, then it doesn't matter what happens. You're essentially a leaf in the wind willing to blow about because there's nothing that's anchoring you to anything. So again, back to the scenario here, if I value loyalty, then I'm going to stick with Becky regardless of what is going on. If I happen to value self-respect and not being yelled at and getting the ability to do whatever I want without any kind of direction, that might inform how I approach the conversation with Becky. And it might really be challenging for me to stay in alignment with those values along with my big picture desire. There's going to have to be some kind of a compromise made. So all these things are, you can see how nuanced and complex this puzzle is, but you have to take the pieces into consideration or it's never going to get put together. And then finally, always want to choose compassion for yourself, for the other person or persons. And again, that big picture idea here, remember that we're all connected, and You don't live in a vacuum. You don't live in a bubble. You don't live on an island. There's no compartmentalizing. It's all bullshit, bullshit, bullshit. So when you can give somebody else compassion, you're only able to do that when you're able to give yourself some compassion too. If you can't give it to yourself, you truly cannot give it authentically to others. So that's something to keep in mind, because you're worthy and deserving of it as well. Okay. The second thing that's important here in how we do things differently is conscious communication. Now, conscious communication is sometimes called compassionate communication, and that term was developed by Marshall Rosenberg, and it's essentially a way of growing self-honoring, mutually respectful relationships. It's how we communicate intentionally with specific techniques. Certainly communicating happens just by me like sitting here, but how I do it, what I do not do, it's all very intentional, with the focus being on compassion and consciousness, okay? And again, its purpose is to provide a space that is mutually, mano a mano, supportive to express emotional needs. That's the key thing to remember here with this. That is the underlying root foundation of true conscious communication that is compassionate and intentional. What does it look like though? Let's go to the structure of it. Okay, 4 key things. First part of this style of communication is you want to identify the behavior or situation that's triggering you. So maybe it's, let's go back to those 6 things that we identified for nonprofit leaders. So maybe it's when you're on vacation or on your time off and you feel like you're not allowed to not check your email or answer a phone call. So there's feelings of resentment that come from that, feelings of stress, of burnout. So those are the feelings. You want to identify the behavior. So it's the receiving the text message, it's receiving the email, it's getting the phone call. Those are the behaviors. The trigger is the feeling that essentially arises. And it's important to acknowledge those feelings and not just deny them or minimize them, as we talked about before. Next part is we want to take responsibility for our feelings, meaning we want to own them. We want to acknowledge them, want to give them presence and space, and not minimize them, not deny them, not sweep them under a rug or basically separate them from who we are. Give them the space to exist because they're part of us and it's giving us information. Step number 3, we want to identify what need that we're not receiving. So remember back at the beginning when we talked about our inner child wounding, it's that part of us that's been basically told, no, don't do that, or yes, do this, or you're too much, or you're not enough. Whatever that messaging taught us, our wounding around rejection, abandonment, not being enough, being unworthy, all of those things. What need is this triggering behavior bringing up for you that you're not getting? So are you not feeling safe enough to speak up for yourself? Are you not feeling accepted if you did speak up for yourself? Do you not feel like you have the freedom to set a boundary? What are those needs that you have that aren't being given to you by yourself? And then once you have those pieces in place, the next step, which is always the simplest but not always the easiest, is asking for what we want. It's really that simple. It can feel scary. It can bring up those feelings of, oh, well, what if this happens? Or what if, those feelings of anxiety or fear around being rejected, being abandoned, success or failure, all of those things. But you know that they're going to be there. But you know also that it's not about what occurs or doesn't occur. It's about you stepping into the ability to ask for what you want. And there is success solely in doing that. Now, I want to mention that vulnerability like this is always going to immediately reduce defenses and open doorways to collaboration. I said always in quotes because there are extenuating circumstances where it does not. In those circumstances where it does not, if it's met with a hard stop or psychological or emotional abusive tendencies, those do happen in the workplace. They do. We can speak about that more offline or later. However, if those are the things that you do encounter, if you're not met with open doorways to collaboration, you want to reconsider the relationship and what boundaries you do have in place to protect yourself and keep yourself in a healthy state of mind and well-being. So now that you know what to do, let's talk about how to do it a little bit more, shall we? We're going to do it with some confidence, with some compassion, but most of all, with ease. So it's time to put your game face on, people. My absolute favorite trick, and Becky knows this one already, my absolute favorite trick to feeling confident in 2 minutes flat is what I like to call the Wonder Woman pose, or also known as a power pose. Okay? Yes, I'm sitting, but yeah. So as you can see by the lovely Linda here, the posture is with your hands on your hips. Your feet are firmly planted, about shoulder width apart. You want your shoulders back, your chest forward, your chin up, and your eyes making direct contact with the other person. And why does this work, you may be asking? There's a couple of things. First, I want to talk about the communication pie chart. So of the 3 components of communication, our word selection, the vocal tone and variety, and our nonverbals, more than half is our nonverbal communication. So even if we didn't say anything, didn't make any noises, we're communicating to the other person this confidence just in the way that we're carrying ourselves. Now, secondly from this, according to Amy Cuddy, our nonverbals do govern how we think and feel about ourselves. It's our bodies changing our mind. Another interesting thing here is mudras, or the specific hand postures that release different things into the body from Eastern philosophies. Really fascinating stuff, how those work. It's the same thing physiologically and psychologically. There's something that happens in that mind-body connection. Now, certain postures, just like the mudras with our hands, simulate or stimulate an increase in testosterone in the body, as well as a decrease in cortisol, the hormone. And those 2 hormones specifically have a direct impact on our confidence levels, as well as relaxation feelings in our body and also our mind. And that happens after the 2-minute mark. So we really want to hang in there on that posture for that time period to fully allow those things to engage internally. And like Becky said, you will feel it. You will feel it, and it's just something that is really simple and effective, and you don't need anything else. You don't need anyone else, and it's always available to you. Your body is willing to help and guide you and heal you along the way. Now, I want to talk about 5 keys to having difficult convos that are mutually honoring and respectful with our last few minutes. Number 1, you want to say what you mean and mean what you say. That's it. So if you set a boundary, like, I'm going on vacation, team, typing this out in an email, I will not be available after this day and time. I will be available on this day and time after you come back. You send that email out. Mean it. Do not email them. Do not call them. Do not check in. Give yourself permission to do what you said you're going to do. 1, that's going to help them know to take you at your word, and that develops trust. And of course you want to foster trust with these people. You guys are working toward a common passion. That's why so many people get into nonprofit work. It's not for the money. Yeah, I got a good laugh there. Okay, anyway. Number 2, you want to allow yourself to feel just in general, but anger specifically mindfully. Okay? Although anger is really a secondary emotion that covers up some of the more tender ones that are underneath, like sadness, hurt, fear, all of those things, anger is still a valid emotion. So if you're angry that people keep speaking to you in ways that make you feel small, that's a valid feeling. I would feel that way too. It doesn't feel good to be talked down to. Allow yourself those feelings. No feeling that you feel is bad. You have to welcome them, because if we don't allow them to be expressed, they're like armadillos. They'll bury into the ground and go under your house and set up shop under there and just cause problems with your foundation and everything else. And so then the house is going to have settling issues and things are going to pop up physically that you didn't realize had anything to do with your emotions. Number 3, you want to validate other people's feelings. Again, not to just be the bigger person or be the nice guy, but when you set an example of how you want to be treated by validating someone else, it's establishing a form of communication with the other person that is going to basically open a doorway to what they're going to respond with, or how they're going to engage in the conversation. So if somebody else comes to you and you guys are having a discussion about why you haven't instituted that raise, and they're scared because they can't pay their bills, and you're scared because you don't know where you're going to get the money, and all of these things, be honest with them. Tell them, I'd understand too. I would be scared too. I don't blame you for feeling that way. There's nothing wrong with saying those things, because then that other person is going to feel seen and feel heard. And it's not just about you and you tell them like, well, I've got to explain to them that we don't have the money and what the hell are we? Of course you know those things. Of course you feel those things. But this person, when we get into their head, they may be not where you are as the leader, and it's not their job to be. Number 4, don't interrupt. How many people hate it here when they're interrupted? Raise your hand high. Yeah, it sucks. So if somebody else is on a ramble, let them have their moment. Because if you interrupt, then they're going to know that maybe it's okay for that to be a common practice between you, where it happens. And they can interrupt you, you can interrupt them, and so nobody's really being heard, because everyone's just listening with the quick option to get in there, say what they have to say, and not really listen to hear and understand anybody else. Number 5, be receptive. Simple. Another way to look at this would be embody some progressive mindsets. Be open to combating inertia. Try something new. Stay open. Be willing to explore alternatives and negotiate, essentially. You didn't get to where you are as an executive director of your organization without being able to learn some negotiation techniques and tactics in your life, professionally or personally. And last but certainly not least, this is my favorite, it's the golden rule. Because ultimately, it's always going to be about what you do and what you say. This personal growth journey has nothing to do with how they respond, how they react, what they give you, other than those are tests for you to see how to show up. So all these feelings of boundary issues, they fall back on us, not on the organization, not on our volunteers, not on our boards, not on our employees, not on our team members. They fall back on our shoulders, which is why this entire presentation has been about inner stuff, because that's where it starts. So today, you've learned why we struggle. what we usually do, what not to do, the 6 key themes that nonprofit leaders struggle with when it comes to implementing boundaries. And we also talked about how to have some difficult conversations with a little more ease and a lot more confidence. I want to thank you guys for having me and tuning in. And I'd love to open it for some Q&A. So Becky, if you would like to unmute, I think we finished right at 9.
Yeah.
You have a better on-time arrival rate than Delta does.
Thank you.
Do what we can. I just wanted to point out on the 5 keys to having difficult conversations that you mentioned, how saying what you mean and meaning what you say develops trust. And that it may be hard to stick with, but when you think about the long-term implications and yeah, that was basically it. The long-term implications of it. It's easier when you think long-term rather than giving into the discomfort of the moment. And I think that that probably goes with everything. All of the 5 keys to handling difficult conversations. That, you know, that if you focus on, okay, right now it feels awful, and I hate it. But I know, like, this time next year it won't be so bad. And I have to say, don't interrupt is like, I'm the worst. Okay, Steve's the worst. I'm the second worst.
I love how Steve didn't interrupt. But
I know, that's very kind of you, Steve.
It's because I took my Ritalin today.
Your what?
My Ritalin. I took my Ritalin today.
Yeah. So do you have like a tip for not interrupting? I would just like that personally.
Oh, this is a great one.
This is why I mute myself. Sorry, I totally just did it. But this is why I keep myself muted when someone else is talking on these things, so that I don't so I have to go through an extra step to say something.
So there's a couple of things that I could say specifically about this. One is having the awareness that you do it first is going to be important. If you're not aware that it's happening, then there's not much you can do to stop it. But once you know it, it's really as simple as acknowledging when it happens and stopping yourself and saying, I'm sorry, I interrupted you, please continue. And making yourself stop. When you've noticed it's happened, acknowledge it by saying, I'm sorry, I interrupted you, please continue. Because that's going to give them permission to know that was not intentional. It's something that you're working on. Whether they take it and it's like, oh, good, she's a personal development person. I'm so glad she's working on this. It has nothing to do with that. But, oh, okay, cool. It wasn't intentional. You're not just a over talker that doesn't want to let other people speak. And the more you do that with practice, the less it's going to happen.
Okay, yeah. In the executive directors group, they talked about, going out for drinks after work with your staff, and I don't know that that's a problem. When does it become a problem? Like, how do we know it's a problem? There's my question. I knew I'd get there eventually.
Well, okay, so in order to understand when a problem arises, we have to understand why a problem would arise.
Okay.
So a business relationship is a relationship that's not based on choice. It's based on circumstance, essentially, because of course we chose to get into the work that we did and where we ended up getting hired. But essentially, we don't have necessarily a choice over who we work with and the circumstances there. Agreed?
Yeah, for the most part, yeah.
So that being said, personal relationships, interpersonal relationships, are those that are ones out of choice. So friendships, family members that we've gotten married to, people that we date, those are all relationships of choice. Relationships of choice tend to have less emotional boundaries with them. And when there is an emotional connection, there is feelings of trust and loyalty and what communication things are discussed very much more diversely than within the business environment. Mm. So you would notice that it's become a problem usually after there's a problem,
yeah.
Unfortunately. So it has to do with the emotional connection, because it's hard for us, like I said before, we don't live in a bubble, we're not on an island, we're not in a vacuum, we can't separate things. So if we've had a relationship that has been professional over here, and I see this guy, and we're not in any way in a fraternization situation, and he asks me out, we end up going out, and then how does that impact the nature of our business relationship? Can we separate that? If, say, he gets promoted, how does that, a power play thing becomes into play in the work environment, but not at home? How emotionally those things impact us in the workplace is where it manifests. It usually doesn't show up on the personal side of things unless it has to do with the business side, which usually comes down to a couple of things. One, feeling like somebody is asking more of us than we're supposed to do because, oh, well, you're my friend, help me out. Or the opposite side of things, where people aren't expecting anything of you and you feel taken for granted, that kind of thing in the workplace. So it all comes back to feelings of the emotional complexity of the relationship, because the dynamics in one space versus the dynamics in another, we're not designed to be able to compartmentalize. We really aren't. So when people say, leave your personal life at the door, I laugh because it just doesn't happen.
Because I'm a person.
Yeah, we're human.
With a life.
Yeah, anytime that you see somebody's work, their quality of work dipping or declining, it's because they're having problems personally. That's a standard. So that being said, it's really unfair to ask us to separate the two. When we try to is when there's things that are impacted. So
it's okay to have these personal relationships at work, but then if a problem manifests at work, then we need to kind of dip into this conscious communication.
Yeah.
To have a difficult conversation.
Because it's not going to be easy. Because ultimately people are hurt, and it comes back to the wounding. Does somebody feel rejected? Does somebody not feel safe? Does somebody not feel free all of a sudden? All of those things. That's what it always comes back to.
Okay.
Yeah. Great question.
I run into the exact opposite coming from the background that I did. Very little of what my work experience has been outside of a situation where you're putting your safety in the hands of the people you work with, not just emotionally invested, but often physically.
Sure.
And I remember it like you said, it clouds how you view. You can't separate. There's no compartmentalization, except in the very short term. I basically more or less can dissociate to handle things that my mind is going, I shouldn't be seeing this. But on a longer scale, I always tell people, I don't differentiate between my friends and my family. If you are one, you are the other to me. Becky, you've experienced this. And going into situations where it's a normal office environment, I don't do well in those scenarios because of the fact that it's the St. Crispin's Day speech from, what is it? Which one of Shakespeare's plays is that? We few, we glorious few, we band of brothers, to use a theater analogy.
And there's an expectation in an office environment of a little bit more distance, like emotional distance. Can we talk real quick, and then then we'll wrap it up because I know we're over, about these feelings of guilt we have as nonprofit leaders when we want anything for ourselves. Money and time.
as I mentioned before, it's essentially, it stems back to us abandoning our own wants and needs and diminishing ourselves as being worth having those. We have to ask ourselves, when we feel guilty about something, why do we feel guilty? Okay, I feel guilty because other people are working and I'm not. I feel guilty because I want to give raises and I don't have the money to. And I know that so-and-so that I care about works really hard. If that's where, as simple as where the guilt stemmed from, then what's stopping us from communicating that and letting the people that we care about know what we're, as the leader of this organization, like if somebody comes to us and say, I feel really guilty. I wish I had the resources to make this happen financially, if it's one of those specific things for someone else. But when it comes to ourselves and not taking time off and not reimbursing ourselves and being on vacation, because we're not really on vacation, we have to ask, why do we do those things? What is it within ourselves that's prompting those behaviors? And be willing to find the space to answer those questions. And if you need assistance in getting to the truth there, reach out for help and be ready for, what this is called in my field is called shadow work. And when we bring awareness to these things that we don't have in our consciousness, it helps for integration so we can move past them, essentially.
Yes. Because I so appreciate your time tonight and the prep that you did to create this for us. How can we support you, and how can we get in touch with you, and how can we help you with the things, because we're giving people. So how can we give back to you now that you've given so much to us?
Oh, I appreciate that the space to even consider that. Well, I'd love it if you took some time just to pop over to my website first and foremost and familiarize yourself a little more with who I am and who I help, and see if there's anybody that comes to mind that you might want to refer my way. That would be really valuable to me. Keeping in mind that just because we think of someone that we're like, oh, so-and-so needs this, they might not want it. And I cannot help someone any more than they are willing and ready to show up for themselves. That's the first thing. So if you think of someone, please pass them my way if they are really inquiring about these kind of themes. And I don't work exclusively with nonprofit leaders, but certainly I do as well, clearly, because Becky, hashtag. But aside from that, I am starting up a round of a group program that I run that Becky mentioned. If you'd like to get more information about that, you can find info at my website. And you can also find it at course.thegenmoff.com. From this information that we did tonight, it just dives much more deeply with a lot of hands-on work